Welcome back. More than 14 months into the special counsel investigation, President Trump has decided to go aggressively after Robert Mueller for what he says are conflicts of interest. The president tweeted yesterday, is Robert Mueller ever going to release his conflicts of interest with respect to President Trump, including the fact that we had a very nasty and contentious business relationship? I turned him down to head the FBI one day before appointment as SC, as in special counsel, and Comey is his close friend. President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, was asked to clarify that tweet this morning. Here is what he had to say.
He's referring to a dispute, which I imagine Mueller, I imagine he disclosed it to Rosenstein when he appointed him because it would involve something that actually wasn't settled even to this day.
What's the conflict?
I can't tell you. I'm not sure I know exactly what the conflict is. I'd like to have a good idea what it is. It's one that would have kept me out of the investigation.
Joining me now is Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. attorney and senior FBI official, as well as an NBC News contributor. Chuck, we don't know this for sure, but it's believed that the conflict the president is talking about is maybe a dispute over fees at one of the golf clubs, we think. What is Rudy Giuliani trying to do here by saying, I can't say what it is, but it would keep me out of the investigation?
Yeah, Katie, it's odd. He says he doesn't even know what it is. He thinks he knows what it is, and it would have kept him out of the investigation, which are all sort of inconsistent with one another. I can assure you this, having worked for Bob Mueller, having been on his staff and having been around that man for quite a while, if he thought he had a conflict of interest, he would step aside. The Department of Justice regulations are incredibly clear, and Bob Mueller knows those regulations inside out. This is just nonsense.
So say he did feel he did have a conflict and he did flag it to Rod Rosenstein. He's still the special counsel. If it was a serious conflict of interest, would Rod Rosenstein allow him to continue to be special counsel?
Nope, sure would not. And there are plenty of ethics officials at the Department of Justice to whom you can go to seek guidance. So when I was U.S. attorney in Eastern Virginia, if an issue came up and I thought it might create a conflict for me, there's a whole bunch of people I can talk to help think through the issue. And by the way most prosecutors handle this is that if there's even an appearance of a conflict of interest, they'll step aside. So the fact that Mueller has not stepped aside tells me, A, he knows exactly what he's doing, and B, he has no concerns about a conflict of interest.
So Bob Mueller was interviewed for the FBI director. The president interviewed him. He did not choose him. Is that a conflict of interest?
No, absolutely not. And by the way, I dispute, I don't have firsthand knowledge, but I have a pretty darn good guess. I dispute with the president's recitation of what happened in the Oval Office. Remember, Bob Mueller had been the director of the FBI for 10 years when President Obama asked him to do another 2. So the man had one of the hardest jobs in the country for 12 years. The notion that he would be in the Oval Office begging for another 10-year term when he was in his 70s strikes me as not credible.
Is it a conflict of interest if he did work for President Obama and President Bush, as you just mentioned?
Not at all. No, not at all. The mere fact that you work in an administration doesn't mean that you have a conflict because you're investigating an official in another administration. That is not a conflict. Nowhere in the Department of Justice regulations is that suggested that that would be a conflict. This is stuff they're just making up, Katie, in order to dirty up Bob Mueller. That's all it is.
He also tweeted this. Why is Mueller only appointing angry Dems, some of whom have worked for crooked Hillary? Others, including himself, have worked for Obama. And why isn't Mueller looking at all the criminal activity and real Russian collusion on the Democrats' side, Podesta dossier? He's saying that everybody who is investigating him, or the people that are investigating him, are angry Democrats. They've gone on and they've mentioned Peter Strzok a number of times. Lisa Page. Peter Strzok has testified in front of the House. The president seems to be indicating that he's running his FBI when his FBI is a deep state that is working against him. Does everybody in the FBI and the Mueller investigation need to come in and present what they think of Donald Trump in order for this investigation to be fair, how they personally feel about him?
No, absolutely not. Look, it's perfectly okay for you, me, and everybody else in the entire world to have our personal views and our personal opinions, right? We all think certain things. It doesn't mean we share them with everybody, and it doesn't mean that it infects or infests our work in any way. The fact that Mueller has a team of folks who may have voted, who may have contributed to certain politicians, is completely beside the point, as long as they can put those views aside when they have to do their work. And by the way, Katie, when Bob Mueller found out what Pete Strzok had been texting, he got him off the team that day pretty darn quickly, because he understands better than anyone how important two things are. Not just that outcomes are fair, but that perceptions of outcomes are fair. He has a very professional team. What they do in their private life, how they vote, to whom they donate, is their private business. They can put that aside to do their work.
Rudy Giuliani has been visible today. Let's put that mildly. We just talked about it a moment ago before the commercial break, about how he's contradicting himself on air. He's denying things that so far have not been alleged. A strategy meeting, talking about the Russia transaction, unclear what transaction he's talking about. It does seem that he's trying to muddy the waters to make this whole investigation very confusing, that this is a PR strategy rather than a legal strategy. Do you think the president is being well served by Rudy Giuliani?
Well, Katie, it depends on what the president wants. If he wants a PR strategy and not a legal strategy, I guess you could argue that Mr. Giuliani is executing on that. To put it kindly, Mr. Giuliani makes absolutely no sense. And as you point out, it is absolutely not a legal strategy. And by the way, Katie, collusion is a crime. We just happen to call it something else. We call it conspiracy, but it is absolutely a crime. You know, you probably won't find the word bank heist in the criminal code, but bank robbery is a crime too. And so I'm sort of perplexed that it's come down to synonyms. I mean, really? These are synonyms. And if these folks don't know that collusion and conspiracy are synonyms for one another, and this is a legal strategy, then they might want to consider changing horses in this race.
Let's talk about how Rudy Giuliani and the president, or Rudy Giuliani more, is going after Michael Cohen, saying that he's a liar, saying that he can't be trusted, that he's unethical. They're very clearly trying to undermine Cohen's credibility. If Cohen ends up being somebody who cooperates with Robert Mueller, and we don't have any indication that he is doing that, or someone who cooperates with the SDNY, how does Robert Mueller's team turn him into a credible witness for the prosecution?
Well, first of all, prosecutors, and I was one for a long time, don't pick their witnesses. Defendants pick their witnesses, right? I mean, it all sort of comes down to who did you commit the crime with and who knows about what you did. And so defendants pick witnesses for the government. The government simply puts them on the stand. And the way you do this, Katie, and it's been going on in every federal courthouse around America today and will next week and next month, is by corroborating your witnesses. You introduce documents, emails, telephone calls, bank records, other witnesses who can testify to what Michael Cohen knew, saw, and heard. So while a case could technically turn on one witness, the law would permit that. That's not how prosecutors work. They find as many different things that they can, or as they can, to corroborate Michael Cohen. I am sure if they use him one day as a witness, he will be well corroborated up, down, and sideways.
What does it say to you that Rudy Giuliani is attacking him so viciously the way that he's doing so far?
Well, it gets back to your earlier point, I think, that this is a political strategy. It's not going to make a bit of difference in a court of law. Prosecutors know how to handle that. It may make a difference in the court of public opinion. And so if that's what Rudy Giuliani is trying to do, to some extent he's succeeding, because, look, here we are talking about it. But if you're talking one day about a trial in front of 12 men and women in a federal court, it's not going to make a darn bit of difference. So, you know, it is what it is, Katie. It's deeply unfortunate. All witnesses have some baggage. By the way, interestingly, the government is required to turn over any information it obtains in the course of its investigation that could impeach or undermine a witness. It must give that to the defendant and his or her attorneys. And so Rudy Giuliani isn't doing anything that the government one day won't have to do itself.
We should also note that Michael Cohen has not been charged with any crime. The raid into his offices and home was in April. He has not been charged with any crime. It is mid-July right now.
That's right.
Chuck
That's
Rosenberg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.